This is a very new problem for governments around the world. If you go to the annual Worldwide Threat Assessment, which is turned over by the intelligence community to Congress each year, and the last one came out in January. You may remember that the president kind of blew a gasket when he discovered that the assessments didn't match up with what he had been saying about Iran and North Korea and ISIS and so forth. But what's interesting about these is that if you go back to 2007 and you go read the cyber section of the report, it won't take you much time. There is no cyber section to the 2007 Worldwide Threat Assessment. It's fascinating. It was only 6 years after 9/11. It said terrorism remains the preeminent threat to the homeland. And then a few weeks later, what happened? Steve Jobs came out right in this neighborhood, held up the first iPhone, and the world changed. If you're looking for your first iPhone, by the way, it's in the back right corner of your nightside table. You just haven't pulled it out in about 10 years. Seems like it's a brick these days. It changed everything because it suddenly made the endpoint, of course, a very viable option for breaking into networks. Because if somebody could get into your phone or any other Internet of Things device, though we weren't calling them that yet, then you will walk it into the network. You'll walk it into your company laboratory. You'll walk it into the Pentagon or the CIA or the NSA. And so you'll make getting into the network that much easier. For the past 6 years now, because of that change, cyber has become the #1 threat as viewed by the intel community. And if you look at the most recent report, it concluded our adversaries and strategic competitors will increasingly use cyber capabilities, including cyber espionage, attack, and influence, to seek political, economic, and military advantage over the US and its allies. Now, you all well know who the main adversaries are here. And what's interesting is they use cyber in ways that mimic the other things that they do in the physical world. So China goes after intellectual property, and of course our core military capabilities. Russia's interested in espionage, but mostly they're interested in disruption. So just as they are sending submarines around, that are following the fiber optic lines across the Atlantic and the Pacific and threatening to cut those and so forth, they're using cyber for disruptive purposes, and the election was just one example. North Korea goes after financial institutions, but also pursues political goals, as do the Iranians. And just as I was getting ready to come up on stage, there was an action that Microsoft took that just got unsealed in court involving Iran's efforts to try to get into the email systems of people who work for the US Treasury and others who are enacting sanctions against Iran. So you can see where the political use of this weapon has become so central. And these systems, as a previous Worldwide Threat Assessment said, are going to be perpetually at risk. What's that mean? It means that no one really expects that the technological solutions that we're kicking around are going to last for very long. This is going to be a constant battle. This is the long Cold War of coding. And we don't have a concept yet about how to go make deterrence work. Now, a few years ago, you would have heard people talk a lot about a cyber Pearl Harbor. The attack that takes out the entire electric grid from Seattle to Los Angeles or Boston to Washington. You don't hear about that very much anymore. And the reason is that it's not, as General Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence, said, the most likely scenario. Instead, the more likely scenario is that you move from surveillance to other uses. And that's why I don't like the comparisons between cyber and nuclear weapons, because you can only turn a nuclear weapon on and off. You can't target it terribly well. You can't adjust the way it's used. But the more work I've done on this, the more I think the right analogy is actually the Wright Brothers and the invention of the airplane. For any of you who've ever visited the University of Maryland at College Park. This is out on what's now the soccer field out there. And it was the Wright brothers showing off the airplane for the first time to a bunch of military generals. They had been showing it in downtown Washington, but President Taft came out and wanted a ride, and they decided that might be aerodynamically difficult. So they moved it up to College Park, and they started showing this because they were broke and they wanted to sell this to the Army. And it's interesting, the Army generals who initially looked at the airplane never discussed arming it. All they talked about was using it for surveillance. What's that sound like? The early days of cyber, right? We knew how to break into mail, we knew how to break into phone calls. Getting into email and networks was just another version.